Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Happy Monday. Hope you are doing well. Hope your weekend, Super Bowl or otherwise, was good. And we're grateful to have you start the week with us as we continue through the Gospel of Luke. We're in the 22nd chapter as we move through Holy Week. And I would say that we're in the part where most of what we think of as Holy Week is coming up, although Luke does give us some dialogue that kind of extends the narrative. But today we are talking about the Passover supper. There's first a moment of preparation, so we'll just read here beginning in verse 7 for a couple verses, and then we'll talk it through. Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. So Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go prepare the Passover meal for us that we may eat it." They asked him, "Where do you want us to make preparations?" "Listen," he said to them, "when you've entered the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house he enters. Say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher says, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, already furnished. Make preparations for us there." So they went and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. If this is familiar to you, and it should be if you've grown up in church or been in church for a while, there's an interesting thing about the stories of Passover that each of them, that several of them, have this moment where there's a kind of question about what they're doing. We saw a little bit of this with where you're going to get the donkey. But there's almost a covert kind of feeling to this. Go ask you're going to see a person, he's carrying water, say this to the homeowner, and they'll show you to the room. It seems complicated. It feels like Luke could have just as easily told us they went and found a room and prepared it. I don't know what's at stake in that, Michael. It's not clear to me that this is particularly educational. Maybe in its day it meant something. Maybe people knew who these characters were, or maybe the idea of secrecy mattered to the early church, who it wasn't often case in hiding. But this has a strange feel to it that I don't think of many other stories having in the gospel. And Luke maybe makes it the most mysterious. There's some of this in the other gospels, but this seems odd to me.
You raise a really interesting point. I don't have an answer, but I want to maybe point us towards the Passover meal and remind us that what the Passover is doing is it's reminding Jews, practicing religious people, of their salvation from Egypt. And the Passover is a moment in which God gives very clear and specific instructions to those ancient Israelites. And God says, you need to do these things. And if you do them, then your house will be passed over. You will be spared. And part of, if you go back to Exodus and you read that text, part of the value that God communicates to Moses is you need to eat bread that's not leavened. You need to eat food that is ready to be picked up and go. It's a very kind of not comfortable meal, because the idea is that it's a mobile meal. It's a meal that you could very quickly get out if that is what you're called and purposed to do. What I think is interesting about a story like this, Clint, is it sets a similar kind of tone in the text. There's a kind of, maybe to the reader, it sounds a little bit like a mystery, but there's a kind of God will provide what you need, even though it's not going to be all laid out perfectly. It's not planned 60 days ahead like a master would plan a party. No, this is we're going to trust God, and all of the things are going to come together, and there will be what we need for a Passover. I'm not saying that's what Luke's trying to show us, but I just think there is a kind of connection there to the spirit of the Exodus and the Passover itself. There's a kind of readiness that was required of the ancient Israelites, and here there's a kind of faith and trust and readiness that the disciples are being asked to practice as well. And of course, if you've been in the church for some time, you know that language actually lives today in our own practice of the Lord's Supper. And I don't want to rush ahead to that, but some of those themes see practice in the church all the way through history up to the present day. And I just think in a master storyteller's account, like we have from Luke, these details do spark our interest, and rarely, if I think we might argue, never were they unintentional or not thought through. So even if we don't know exactly what's going on here, I assure you that Luke is giving great thought to how to tell the story. And I think there's some elements in here that strike me as really interesting.
Yeah, it is intriguing. Does Jesus know this man? Does he just know there's going to be a guy there with water? Is there some plan the disciples? It seems like a lot of secrecy for an event that nearly every Jew in Jerusalem, if not every Jew in Jerusalem, would have been celebrating and preparing for. So let's focus. Let's kind of turn that dial in and focus for a minute on this idea of Passover. So as Michael mentioned, Passover is the Jewish remembrance and celebration of what we call that final plague, when the Israelites, the Hebrews, are slaves in Egypt. The angel of death comes, and those whose doorposts are marked with the blood of the sacrificed lamb. And the language is important because in the instructions they're given, it is to be a lamb without blemish. And that sacrificed lamb, whose blood is on the doorpost, causes the angel of death to pass over the house. And so the Egyptian sons are sacrificed, are killed, but the Israelites are saved. And in the aftermath of that, God, through Moses, institutes this annual celebration of the Passover where they are to retell the story. And if it's not something with which you're familiar, it would be worth your time to Google Seder supper, Seder, or Passover meal. See if you could find the liturgy. It is a very scripted meal. There is salt and water to symbolize tears. There's horseradish to symbolize bitterness. There's unleavened bread to symbolize the rush to escape Egypt. Every part of the meal is designed to retell the story of deliverance. In fact, and I won't get this may not be exactly right, but the Passover meal starts with a liturgy that begins with words very close to when we were slaves in Pharaoh's Egypt. And so each time they celebrate the Passover, they relive and retell that story of God's deliverance. And this becomes an important backdrop for the gospel story. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But I don't know what the Christian equivalent of this is, Michael. I mean, in some ways we could liken it to communion, but it's less occasional. It is more infrequent. Most Christians celebrate communion monthly or quarterly. It would be maybe Easter-like in terms of its importance on the calendar, but the tone would be very different. I'm not sure we have a good equivalent that helps us make sense of this, but it's very hard to understand the nuance of the crucifixion and resurrection stories if you don't have a working understanding of the Passover.
Yeah, so to that end, I just want to, we're not going to linger here, but I want to put this up so that you all see this. This is Exodus chapter 12, and we would definitely recommend, as part of the study this week, it would be worth your time going to Exodus chapter 12, seeing this language about verse 5 here, lamb without blemish, which Clint just mentioned, the doorposts, verse 7. We're going to have talk about what you should do with your leaven and your bread. All of this is in there. And all of that is to say that while for us that may need some education, we have to remember that the people who received this book from Luke, the first disciples, were worshiping in synagogues. They were a part of Jewish families and Jewish practice and Jewish life. That the earliest Christian church grew up alongside that religious tradition. So these themes and this knowledge, this practice that Clint is talking about, it would have been known to most Christians, certainly as the church was close to its center in Jerusalem, and then as it extended out beyond that time and of course became more and more Gentile, then it became more and more difficult to sort of pass on some of those previous traditions because the Christian traditions themselves began to take root, and the church began to have its own practice, liturgies, and worship, and in church. But it's worth all that to say, Clint. It's worth recognizing that the New Testament is full of allusions and references and foundations built upon the Old Testament and those stories, God's salvific work for the people of Israel. And that is a huge precursor to the text that we're going to read and this supper that Jesus has with his disciples. I don't know that we could overstate how important the Passover context is to the meal that Jesus has with his disciples. It matters. And sometimes we need to sort of educate ourselves or get up to speed to sort of get all of the senses of that.
Well, I think we drastically undervalue it, Michael. I mean, I don't think it occurs to a lot of Christians. And when we talk about the Last Supper, and for us that becomes the occasion of communion, Jesus' Last Supper is a religious feast that has a very scripted liturgy, including the ingredients and the menu. And Jesus is eating the Passover meal, the Seder supper with his disciples. When it says tomorrow, when we read, he took bread and broke it, that bread snapped because it wasn't a loaf.
Right.
It was a wafer because he was using unleavened bread. When it says cup, that was the cup that held the salt water, and then the herbs are dipped in it, and then it's filled with wine. This is all the context out of which we get our own story, and I think far too often we underappreciate the context Jesus is in. Jesus institutes what we call the Last Supper at a religious supper, and there's layers, and I think, again, knowing that, especially for Matthew, for Luke, Mark, John does his own stuff, but the Jewishness and Jesus' own religious context help tremendously to clarify and understand the subtext of the stories. And so this idea about preparation, that they're making, that they're not just showing up, they're preparing the Passover meal, and it's in the hands of Peter and John. That there is a solemnness to this that I think we can miss if we don't try to put a little work in understanding the context.
There's a temptation for me in this conversation to rush ahead to the next conversation, which is the meal and all of its theological significance. But we would be amiss to do that if we failed to pause long enough to see, to your point, Clint, that this meal is a somber meal. It's a remembrance of God's saving, yes, God's might and God's perseverance of his people, yes, but also of death, of being spared from calamity, of the reality of needing to be rescued from subjectivity, being made subject to Pharaoh. And by the way, in Jesus's day, doing so in Jerusalem, which is captive to Rome. Once again, the people are experiencing captivity in their own way. So these themes were powerful the night that Jesus gathered, before the church came to realize the other layers, of which there's an infinite. But before even we got to that, there was already a kind of depth to the preparation for this meal. It is a solemn meal. And we, especially maybe busy Americans, if that's the camp you find yourself in, we find ourselves often rushing from table to table. Sometimes we fail to recognize the substantial, providential kind of theological ideas of preparing a feast, of God giving us what we need for that meal. This particular observance would have made that explicit, that we need to prepare, but also because in doing so, God has prepared. God's given us what we need. We need to trust God because the God who rescued us then, ergo Exodus, is the God that we call and recognize to be present with us in the now. All of that's happening in the preparation of this meal, and we should see that because it will provide really valuable, important, essential frames to then also see what Jesus does that is absolutely unique to his observance of that meal and how Christians come to understand it later.
Yeah, I think in order to understand the new thing Jesus does that we'll look at tomorrow, it is just helpful to understand the old thing that Jesus has done. You know, in rough numbers, Jesus is in his early 30s at this point in the story, and that means for probably 30 times Jesus has celebrated this Passover with his mother and father, later with his mother when Joseph dies, probably already more than once with his disciples. This is not new for Jesus. This would have been a part of his annual spiritual life. He would have known the liturgy. He would have understood. This is something that he has done multiple times, and yet in this context, he approaches it and gives it new meaning, new life, new direction. And for those of us who inherit those new things, new at the time, I do think some understanding of the previous things helps deepen our own appreciation for what it is that we inherit and receive.
A detail that strikes me, I don't have an answer to this, Clint, but you know my love for the Gospel of John. It's hard for me to read this text and not have this small, what may be a small detail in verse 10. A man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him into the house. And one of the things that my imagination goes to is, of course, in John, there's a wedding in Cana where water and wine play a very important role in the beginning of Jesus's ministry. Now, that's not to say that that's exactly what's happening here, but these are some of the imaginative places I think that we go when we read the scriptures. You might see a detail and wonder, what is that? And for me today in this reading, if I was going to do some further study, I think it would be on that detail. I'd be interested, what's going on? Why follow the person with the jar of water? That's an interesting detail.
Well, and I mean, I think strangeness abounds in those couple of verses, Michael, because first of all, you have a man carrying water. Why is that happening? Secondly, he carries the water into the house, but he's not the owner of the house, because you're supposed to say to the owner of the house, so is that a servant? There's nothing but question marks in that, and if they mean something,
yeah,
I don't know what they are. Maybe there's a Luke scholar out there who will one day find this and help us, but I think those are head scratchers for me.
Head scratchers are most often, I think, opportunities to enter into the text deeper, and I certainly hope that we can all avail ourselves of those. Thanks for being with us here today. In many ways, this is a beginning note of a much deeper song. So I hope that you will join us for the continuance of this study tomorrow. But until then, be blessed, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.